By the end of the Second World War, American troops arrived at a place known as Mittelwerk. Here, they discovered a large, secret military factory of the Third Reich. It was hidden deep within a mountain range, riddled with railway tunnels. What was produced at this factory? Why was it concealed underground? Who worked here? And is it true that the main engineers and scientists of the factory were evacuated by special agencies? Today, we will attempt to tell you the story that has been secret for many years. Let's begin our investigation with the Mittelbau Dora concentration camp. During the Second World War, the Germans brought people captured in Eastern European countries here for slave labor. Primarily, prisoners were used to expand the tunnels in the mountain range where gypsum had been previously mined. The conditions were extremely harsh. They worked for 14 hours a day, denied access to basic hygiene, beds, and adequate food. Approximately every third of the 60,000 prisoners sent to Dora Mittelbau perished. Often, workers died from hunger, exhaustion, or related illnesses, and about 1/500 died from Allied bombing. It's also established that 200 to 300 people in the camp were hanged. By order of the SS, a camp orchestra was created in Dora Mittelbau, which played during roll calls and likely for the entertainment of officers and guards. During their free time, in their cramped living quarters, prisoners entertained themselves by singing and playing music. Block number 3 served as the main venue for concerts by prisoners of different nationalities, who gathered here every day after dinner to sing for each other. Memories of a former prisoner about these days help us imagine the comforting part of life in the midst of this block.
Czech prisoners preferred songs about wanderings, especially the march, Old Friends. To this melody, they sang such words. They silently carried their heavy fate. They worked until they fell into a stone abyss. These words were highly relevant to Dora Mittelbau. Poles performed a song from The Miner. A young miner goes to work. Russians sang Volga Volga. Germans, Lili Marlene. Only the English did not sing any songs.
As you may have understood, prisoners were used not only to expand tunnels. A factory for the development of special weapons was located in the mountain range. The military has a persistent expression, Wunderwaffe, which, as known, means miracle weapon, and was coined by the German Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. It was implied to be a universal solution that would solve all problems. However, much of such German developments remained only on paper and were not implemented in reality. And now, the expression Wunderwaffe is used more in an ironic context due to its illusory nature. But this does not apply to the revolutionary, at that time, rocket called V2. It was on this factory that the world's first ballistic missile, which crossed the Kármán line, the imaginary boundary between Earth's atmosphere and outer space, was assembled. Although there has long been speculation about other exotic weaponry being constructed or stored at Mittelwerk, evidence of this is scarce. For example, Richard Overy notes in The Bombing War, Europe, there is some evidence that small spherical bombs containing radioactive waste were stored in the Mittelbau Dora works, but it is not conclusive. Moreover, U.S. intelligence established before the end of the war that the Germans were far behind in the development of nuclear weapons. So, the prisoners of the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp were ruthlessly exploited to assemble the V2 rockets. Skilled labor was required for such work, and moreover, the prisoners digging tunnels were severely weakened. It has been established that in May 1944, the chief developer of the rocket, Wernher von Braun, visited the factory and learned about the need to employ an additional 800 educated French workers. It is crucial to discuss the personality of the scientist himself, as he will later play a significant role in human history. Von Braun was undoubtedly a member of the SS, and even his photograph in this militarized uniform has been preserved. However, the scientist himself claims that he wore it only once. Here's how Adam Kabala, a former Buchenwald prisoner, spoke about him.
Also, the German scientists led by Professor Wernher von Braun were aware of everything daily. As they went along the corridors, they saw the exhaustion of the inmates, their arduous work and their pain. Not one single time did Professor Wernher von Braun protest against this cruelty during his frequent stays at Dora. Even the aspect of corpses did not touch him. On a small area near the ambulance shed, inmates tortured to death by slave labor and the terror of the overseers were piling up daily. But Professor Wernher von Braun passed them so close that he was almost touching the corpses.
Von Braun later stated that he was aware of the treatment of prisoners, but felt helpless to change the situation. When asked if von Braun could have protested against the brutal treatment of the slave laborers, von Braun team member Konrad Dannenberg told the Huntsville Times, "If he had done it, in my opinion, he would have been shot on the spot." Thus, even after some time, it is difficult to determine the scientist's attitude toward Nazi ideology. But we know that the researcher sometimes even personally selected prisoners necessary for the factory. Moreover, the prisoners themselves spoke of him in an extremely negative context. They believed that the scientist was poisoned by Nazi ideology. And if he himself did not seek to destroy people based on nationality, he also did nothing to prevent it. Special sub-camps were created for production work, which often were located underground and connected to the main plant by tunnels. There's even a photograph of a rusty rocket frame in one of these underground camps. How important was the production of the V-2 for the Germans? Initially, upon seeing the developments of the predecessor rockets A-4 and V-1, Hitler was unimpressed. He considered it merely long-range artillery. But later he stated, "If we had had this weapon in the 1930s, we would not have needed to start this war." In reality, the mass production of the V-2 lasted just over a year. Moreover, in 1944, due to sabotage by employees, instead of the expected 13,500 units, only 5,946 were produced. Also, it is possible that thanks to sabotage, many rockets did not explode or did not reach their target. The director of the Dora Mittelbau Museum wrote a small book about life in the concentration camp, Dora. Here, he mentions that the prisoners were marked with letters according to their ethnic background, as well as colored armbands indicating the reasons for their imprisonment. For example, political prisoners wore red armbands, religious offenders, purple, homosexuals and others, pink, marginals and Roma, black. Professional criminals were given green armbands. The SS used them as their agents since real criminals were willing to betray members of the underground movement for bread and cigarettes. It has been established that the Protestant group was led by a German, Albert Kuntz. Also, sabotage was largely organized thanks to a Czech doctor, Jan Česneva, and his assistant. Using medical opportunities, he met with many prisoners and passed instructions between them: how to disable the electrical control or change the voltage in the radio receiver. Prisoners managed to cause damage in such a way that the rockets passed testing, but then failed to work. It is known that underground members of the movement maintained contact with the Buchenwald camp. After all, they sent dead bodies there for cremation. They attached a message to the corpse's hand, and thus conveyed information from Dora. Counting the number of victims affected by this rocket is very difficult. Most often, London and Antwerp were subjected to attacks, resulting in approximately 5,000 deaths and about 10,000 injuries combined. It turns out that more people were affected during the rocket assembly than during the attacks. But one should not forget about the significant psychological pressure, as the V-2, traveling faster than the speed of sound, gave no warning before impact, unlike bombing planes or the V-1 flying bomb, which made a characteristic buzzing sound. American pilot William Liscombe Borden vividly described the flight of the V-2, which he encountered during a mission.
It resembled a meteor. streaming red sparks and whizzing past us as though the aircraft were motionless. I became convinced that it was only a matter of time until rockets would expose the United States to direct transoceanic attack.
The problem also lay in the fact that the rockets were highly mobile and could be launched from almost anywhere, even, for example, from the forest. A scientific reconstruction conducted in 2010 showed that the V2 creates a crater 20 meters, 66 feet, wide and 8 meters, 26 feet deep, throwing about 3,000 tons of material into the air. The only effective way to counter this weapon was to damage the factory infrastructure. For this purpose, the RAF and the USAAF carried out operations such as Hydra and Crossbow. However, the result of these operations was the death of about 500 to 600 concentration camp prisoners. Some markers were dropped too far south, causing aerial bombs to hit residential barracks. And the US War Department concluded that the British Hydra operation did not materially affect the course of German military production, and that German military production in general continued to increase. After these attacks, the Germans even created artificial damage, drew destroyed beams and created craters to convince the Allied army of the success of the operations and to delay further attacks. As the war drew to a close, Nazi Germany increasingly used the V2 in the vain hope of changing the course of the war. They called the rocket the weapon of retaliation and wished to avenge the successful advance of the Allied armies. The last V2 was launched by the Germans on March 27, 1945. On April 3, 1945, the US Army was preparing to attack military barracks near the Mittelwerk underground factory. The Royal Air Force of Great Britain supported the offensive with bombing raids. However, it turned out that these were not barracks, but rather barracks of the concentration camp, which used slave labor for rocket production. Once again, numerous prisoners perished in the attack. On April 4th, the survivors were finally evacuated from the camp. What was seen in the concentration camp shocked everyone. Here are some quotes from Roy Fedden's inspection report of this place in 1945.
The mission had been told that Nordhausen was a large underground factory and that they would see extraordinary production methods, but they had no idea that they would be brought face to face with such an undertaking.
He further described what he saw as follows.
Some of the mission visited a slave workers' encampment, talked to a Dutch doctor who had been there throughout the war, and saw many of the wretched inmates who were in an appalling state, although receiving every medical attention now. They also saw stretchers heavily saturated in blood, a room in which there was a slab on which the bodies were drained of blood, and the incinerators in which the bodies were burnt.
Before we continue our historical analysis, we kindly ask you to subscribe and like this video. This will signal to YouTube algorithms that the video is engaging to users and help promote its reach. The US Army transported all assembled V2 rockets using freight cars. All documentation was destroyed by the Germans. Also, many scientists involved in the research were evacuated, including Wernher von Braun, whom we have already mentioned today, and researchers such as Arthur Rudolph, Walter Till, Walter Dornberger. The military hurried to evacuate these people to the western part of Germany to prevent high-tech knowledge from falling into the hands of the advancing Red Army. In the summer of 1945, Operation Paperclip began, in which a combination of intelligence agencies evacuated German scientists to the United States. To bypass President Truman's order, as well as the Potsdam and Yalta agreements, the JOA falsified professional and political biographies for a number of German specialists whose knowledge and experience were needed by the country. Sometimes even rat lines were used, underground routes used by some Nazis fleeing defeated Germany. Eventually, Wernher von Braun and his team ended up in Texas. His chief design engineer, Walter Riedel, became the hero of a December 1946 article titled, "German Scientist Claims American Food is Tasteless and Chicken is Like Rubber." The material revealed the presence of von Braun's team in the US, which prompted criticism from Albert Einstein and John Dingell. However, this did not prevent the controversial figure of von Braun from becoming the father of American rocketry. Yuri Gagarin's spaceflight prompted John F. Kennedy to deliver a programmatic speech in which he stated that for the nation's prestige, it was necessary to ensure that an American astronaut landed on the moon by 1970. Wernher von Braun became the head of the U.S. lunar program. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong, commander of Apollo 11, became the first person to set foot on the lunar surface. For this flight, von Braun was awarded the NASA Distinguished Service Medal. It's interesting to note that Soviet developers, with the help of remaining V-2 rocket components and some German scientists, managed to recreate the V-2 rocket as the first Soviet space rocket, the R-1. For some time, the Red Army controlled the Mittelwerk factory, but then they blew up the main entrances and left Nordhausen. Only in 1995 was a new tunnel dug, leading to the railway line. 710 meters of the tunnel system were opened for visitors. Large parts of the system are flooded by groundwater, while other parts have collapsed. Willy Kramer, a German archaeologist and scientist who dived in the tunnel system in 1992 and 1998, estimated that 70 tons of material were looted. Thus, the grim history of the underground factory ends with oblivion, looting, and slow but all-consuming erosion.